Okay, so today I have the pleasure of talking with 𝗀𝗃𝗏 from Meta Consultancy. Jestina,
Hello.
it's an absolute pleasure to be talking with you today. Thank you very much for joining me. Could you please just start by telling us a bit about yourself?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. James, it's a pleasure to be here, and it's a very interesting topic and a great opportunity to have a chat.
Oh, thank you very much. I've been really looking forward to it. So your language background is very interesting. So I'm right in thinking that English is not your first language. Is that correct?
Well, it's a tricky question because it actually, nowadays, I would say it is my first language, but I was born in Poland, born and grew up in Poland, but started traveling and, well, started learning English very, very early. I was 6 and then started traveling in my teens. So kind of left Poland and the country long time ago, and English took over. So it kind of became my number one language. I do speak Polish. I do speak a little bit of German and Spanish, and right now learning Portuguese.
Okay, so multilingual in that case.
And you asked a little bit about myself. I'm a business English communications coach, and I work mostly with corporate clients, I would say, in big companies in Germany, Japan, and Italy. So that's what I do at the moment, working with non-native speakers. Previously, I worked as an EFL teacher, English as a foreign language, and also a teacher trainer. So I guess together I have around 18 years of experience in EFL. But like I said, I worked and lived abroad in mostly European countries, and I also worked a little bit in tourism. So there is a side to my experience as well.
And so before your career as an English language teacher, which English-speaking countries did you work in, or perhaps as an English language teacher?
So my first working experience was in Scotland, near Aberdeen.
Okay.
And also Ireland, and most recently Malta, where I lived for around 13 years. I got a bit stuck in Malta.
I'm sure it's a nice place to be stuck in.
Yes.
What was the experience like then of living and working in Scotland and Ireland? Because a lot of people say that the accent there is really quite difficult. Was it a challenge for you?
Yes and no. I think I was young enough and flexible enough to embrace the accents. But yes, in Ireland, I worked at a hotel at the reception. So answering the phone was something that was a little bit difficult to start with. I got used to it pretty quickly, but every person speaks in their own way, with their own mannerisms, you could say. And I think that's what also makes it difficult. You know, sometimes you would get a person from a Scottish village really far away calling you on the phone, and the first initial moment is like, oh my God, I don't understand the word.
Yes, accents are quite an interesting area, aren't they? Because as you say, everybody has an accent. So it's really just almost silly to say that there's correct and incorrect accents, but we still judge people on them, whether we like it or not, a lot of the time, I think.
And I think that, sorry if I can interrupt what you said, we judge and we also compare. So our students like to compare to, I don't know, the British accent or the American accent in their mind, and that's what they think. And really and truly, there is no such thing. And it's very difficult for non-natives to understand that there is not just one British RP, for example. Some people do speak this way, but a lot of people don't.
That's it. I mean, there are hundreds of accents in the UK, let alone dialects as well. So it's difficult to say that there's one standard form. And even if there was, there's no real reason why the form or the accent of a native speaker is necessarily correct. I mean, when you look at it numerically, native speakers of English are significantly in the minority, about 25% of the English-speaking world. So why would that make our so-called accent correct? It just doesn't really make any sense. Do you find it still the case, though, that a lot of EFL or ESL students aspire to have a native speaker-like accent, or has that changed over the years?
Well, I'm a perfect example of that. When I was growing up, what my aim was to get the British accent. That's what I was aspiring to. And it took years to understand that this is, one, never going to happen. And two, it's impossible because that kind of one model doesn't exist. And I think it kind of goes for both sides. Native speakers, they kind of take it for granted and they just accept, okay, you are from maybe this area in England, or maybe you're from Ireland and Scotland, and it's easier for them to understand the differences and recognize the accents. And they are also exposed to them. And I think the exposure is the key, whereas non-native speakers are not exposed to so many different ways people speak. So therefore, they don't even realize that, okay, this one perfect way of speaking just doesn't exist.
That point about exposure is really interesting, because I think we often, as native speakers, don't consider the fact that because the vast majority of English is spoken between non-native speakers, as I was saying earlier, my accent is in the minority, and there's no reason why non-native speakers should have been exposed to my particular accent. Now, with generic British, generic American accents through Netflix and movies and what have you, yes, some of those accents are more widely spread through sort of global culture, if you like. But I've had to learn that I can't assume that just because English is my first language and I'm from England, that makes my accent easy to understand. Because actually people may never really have conversed with somebody who speaks like me. It'll more often than not be between two non-native speakers, perhaps with a Portuguese and a Polish accent, but speaking in English, for example. So the idea that I can be understood because I'm an Englishman is not necessarily correct. It doesn't really make sense.
Yeah.
You seem to do a lot of work in business communications training. So I'm guessing you're mainly focused on helping EFL students or non-native speakers to communicate. What sort of things do you do? What sort of things do you look at?
We kind of go step away from just purely teaching English. And I've noticed that over time that this kind of usual classroom doesn't exist anymore. It's what the students, first of all, need, what they want and need. And it's mostly giving them opportunity to speak and on a frequent basis. So that's a lot what we're doing, and discussing different situations and some problems that they're having at work. It's really going into the nitty-gritty in their own particular situations. But something you said earlier made me think about this quote that I've seen somewhere. Native speakers are terrible at communication. I don't remember where I read it, but sometimes, and I also heard that from my students, that, you know, there is this kind of situation where non-natives are having a Zoom call, for example, and there is a person from Portugal, person from Germany, person from Poland, and they're all happily communicating, listening to each other. And then suddenly a British person joins the call. And the one thing happens very often is that the level of communication goes down, which is really sad. Or some kind of idiom that the native person uses, and then everyone is lost from then on. And that these kind of things, very often native speakers don't realize that it's difficult to translate literally, especially idiomatic language. And they might have a very, very strange or sometimes opposite meaning in their own language, if then they are able to translate it one-to-one. So it's really sad to hear that, you know, we took the language kind of from you and made it grow into something else. And in some ways, I feel that native speakers are a little bit lost sometimes in this world. I don't know if you would agree with me, but it's even the lessons that I have with students, we learn how to listen. We learn how to like set specific skills of listening to yourself, listening to your own words. Like, it's a very difficult skill to speak and listen at the same time. And we do that in order that they self-correct. So they know what they said and they can paraphrase or say it in another way or correct themselves. And I don't think in my native language, I really don't think I listen to myself. I'm just producing the thoughts and they come out. So this is something really valuable, I notice, in business communications, being able to listen and speak simultaneously.
And it's a very difficult thing to do, as you say. And I think I agree with you that native speakers may well be lost in some respects, because you've described situations from your own experience and that of your students where communication breaks down when a non-native speaker enters the conversation. And then you describe the efforts that non-native speakers are going to improve communication skills, particularly in the second language. But of course, most native English speakers are monolingual. We have a terrible track record of learning other languages. We don't really know what it's like. We lack the instinctive empathy, at least based on experience. And we've probably not been through the kind of structured exercises that you've just described, looking at the nitty-gritty of communication, thinking about active listening, focusing on what the other person's saying before you try to respond yourself. And you mentioned some more specific things like idioms and the ability to paraphrase, perhaps to repeat back what someone said or to explain yourself in a different way. And those things, it's interesting, you're talking about that in the context of communicating in a second language. They're skills that are quite important in order to be successful at that. And you said you don't really think of yourself doing that in your first language, or at least in Polish. And I suspect that's true for a lot of native English speakers who don't speak another language. So there's almost that awareness and training gap with native speakers. And I like your point about, you said, we've taken the language from you and changed it into something different. And it's a really interesting one, that I think it's easy for us being native speakers, perhaps to assume that we own the language, not a term I particularly like. And of course we don't. And even if we do, we can't control it. It's a global phenomenon to enable people to communicate, and people change and adapt it according to their needs.
And I like to think that language is like a creature. It keeps on growing. It keeps on deviating. We keep on taking the expressions from different languages into English as well, which is a beauty of the language, you know. And we're very lucky that English became the lingua franca. And there is a university professor that I follow, also Polish, Marek Kiczkowiak from University of York. He did his PhD over there, and I think he works in Brussels at the moment. But he was the one that we're talking 5 years ago, where he really tried to vocalize and make everyone aware that English is a lingua franca, something that people used to try to achieve with other languages. I know Esperanto as well, but it failed. And we're very lucky to have this lingua franca in the form of English at the moment. And I love it. You know, it's not an extremely difficult language to learn, to learn the basics. Of course, to master it is very difficult, and it takes a lot of time and effort. And maybe that's another thing that non-native speakers, and I think to a degree native speakers experience as well, is the frustration. So from non-native point of view, you get a lot of frustration because depending on your background, I notice Italian people like to speak a lot, and they have a lot of thoughts and a lot of power to put them out there. And there is this frustration because it takes time to process in a second language. So they can even physically and mentally get tired from speaking another language. But there is this kind of frustration that I want to say it, I don't want to sound stupid. Sometimes you even have this stigma that because I couldn't say the word and I know it in Italian, I'm going to sound stupid. Or if I make a mistake, even for Japanese people, you're losing your face if you make a mistake in another language or in your own as well. So there is this feeling of frustration. And I think from the other side as well, there is a little bit of frustration because, but you speak English, so what's your problem? Like, why don't you understand me? I speak English, you speak English good enough. Like, why there is no communication flowing? So frustration kind of appears, and there, of course, must be techniques and tools to deal with it. And I'm sure patience and empathy would come into play here.
And I think communicating about communication as well is often a really important thing. So actually almost saying what you just said, if you're having a Zoom meeting with a group of people, explaining it's okay to ask questions. Don't worry if you need to take a bit of time to find the words that you want to use. Almost, I don't like the term giving permission to people. It sounds rather arrogant, as though it's your permission to give, but just acknowledging that there are strategies that people have for communication, and it's okay to deploy different strategies when required. As you say, a lot of that does begin with empathy. You mentioned the frustration of miscommunication in a fairly general sense, which I think everybody can relate to. Have you got any specific examples that come to mind of any communication problems that have resulted more from native speaker problems than the non-native speakers? So you said with non-native speakers, I can't find the word, or I don't know what I need to say, which is a fairly common thing we hear in English language teaching and coaching. But what about issues caused by native speakers? Have you experienced that at all?
So as an example, I could say that unfortunately, sometimes native speakers just would repeat themselves exactly the same thing they said, but just say it louder. And that's from the other side. It's patronizing even, like you don't have to repeat exactly the same thing and louder. Like I can hear, my hearing is fine. So I've experienced that as well. Or it happens also with, like I said, idiomatic language. Someone would repeat the same thing even 3 times, thinking that, okay, by the 3rd time, I'll understand what you mean. Whereas it's such a local thing sometimes with idioms that, okay, yes, I know all words that in the idiom includes, but together it really doesn't make sense to me. And also with idioms, it's a nice thing. Sometimes my students would translate idioms from their language, hoping that it would make sense in English. And sometimes it does, sometimes it really doesn't.
I mean, idioms are great fun. We use them all the time, but they only work if you know that everyone you're communicating with does actually know those idioms. And I think it's a mistake we make sometimes as EFL teachers, because you can run a class looking at idioms and students tend to love them. Because they are fun, they're interesting,
Colourful.
and when you learn them, you're part of that group. You know something that other people don't, and you can connect with your interlocutors in a way that other people can't. So in that way, they're great. But the problem is, if you go into a business meeting with people you've never met before, and you start using idioms, if people don't understand those particular idioms, all meaning is lost and it just becomes hopeless. So I tend to say to English language teachers as well that yes, they're great fun, yes, teach them. But when you're trying to help native speakers communicate better, tell them to avoid idioms like the plague, we sometimes say they get that. Because if you don't, you're actually inadvertently excluding so many other people in that room potentially, and communication breaks down. And people don't like to say, oh, actually, sorry, I didn't understand that phrase at all because I haven't learned it. Can you explain it to me? People just generally don't. They tend to remain quiet, saving face, as you say, which is a pity, really.
Yeah. And maybe I have one more example that personally I'm struggling at the moment. Something in my lessons recently came up. It's about writing emails. And we have all this etiquette about writing emails, the email templates, the formats, the register formality. There are so many rules and so many things that English books for non-natives teach. And even exams check that. So yes, I'm kind of traditional in my techniques sometimes as well. And I do teach these things to my students. But then just recently, one of them came back to me saying, Justina, I just really don't understand that. I got this email from an American person and there is no please, no hello. One line, I need this paper. And they feel lost, like all this effort to learn this correct way, to be polite, to be well understood. And it just all goes down the drain when a native speaker replies to the one sentence, no please, no thank you, no hello. And I don't even know what to tell them in this situation.
No, I agree with you. Again, it's what we were saying earlier about there being almost no one single standard form of English. There are so many cultural influences, and influences including on directness as well. So I notice internally within our company, if I'm communicating with some of my colleagues, we hardly ever put our names at the top or the bottom of the email. We know each other really well. We've worked together for years. I don't need to write, Dear Justina, I'm just writing to you to say, would you mind meeting me in half an hour on Zoom? Thank you very much. Yours sincerely, James. We don't need any of that. The register and the formality changes, and it'll be Zoom, 30 minutes, please. And that's okay. But of course, if you were to show that to an outsider, it looks so brusque and blunt and rude, and you wouldn't do that with a client, obviously. So yeah, I can understand email etiquette. The changes of language use can be really quite problematic.
Well, you mentioned the meaning of words. And yes, the words differ from country to country, but also within one language, words can have different meanings. And this is an exercise I stole from a card game called Teamwords. It's used in HR. I don't know if you've heard. It was developed by David and Mary Sherwin in America. And I kind of like this exercise. So basically you take a random card and there is an adjective written on it. And the whole team or a group or a small group of people would discuss what that word means to them or for them. So you would have, for example, the word professional. And I did that with a few of my students, a few of my classes. And it's brilliant to see, like, from country to country, how different the meaning of the word is. And it doesn't have to be that we are from different countries. It's just, to me, professional means this. To you, it means completely something else. And it happens with many different words, like the word creative. We spend a lot of time talking about the word mindful. And for some people, it's the mindful. For some people, it's mindful that has got the bigger meaning. And it's just beautiful. And it's the key to all this is communication, is having the time to meet and spend some time discussing what does this thing mean to me? What does this thing mean to you? Native, non-native doesn't really matter. But it's just beautiful to decide, even together on a definition of something. And then we know we're on the same page.
I think there's a lot to be said for co-creation of meaning. As you say, discussing what this means and agreeing on something together in order to be able to communicate and then move forward. And you're talking about a lot of really interesting and complex subjects, really, what we've discussed so far. But I know you said before we started this podcast that simplification is something that's really important to you. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Sometimes for the sake of communication, we have to learn how to simplify, and we have to learn what kind of words are safe to use, what kind of words are easier to understand, or maybe exist in the other language as well. Like I'm, for example, learning a lot about German. I had no idea that the word nuance exists in German as well. I thought it's like a very proper British word. So these kind of things really help, and having the exposure of understanding these different languages. Oh, one thing I wanted to mention about Netflix, you said that earlier. There is now this option on Netflix to watch films that were made in different countries. And it's really pretty to hear that they actually dubbed with the accent from their country. So you would listen to, I know, there's a Spanish lady and she speaks English with a very strong Spanish accent. I think it's so cute. I think nice. It's adorable. Yeah. So simplification is very important. And something that I maybe use it to my students' advantage. I like to motivate my students and give them kind of confidence and proof of their level. They speak amazingly well, especially the German students. Their level is really high, but they still have this lack of self-confidence. And as an example, what I like to tell them is that imagine you starting to speak with a native speaker and he or she is just talking to you normally and not slowing down, not dumbing down the language. And I tell them that's a good thing. Even if you don't understand one or two words, you're still able to understand what's going on in the conversation. Don't focus on the negative, on the errors or the things that you might have missed. Focus on the positives. And if the speaker doesn't slow down, it means that they kind of see you as a good match. You know, they think that you understand everything. They assume that, okay, you're my equal kind of. And it's a really beautiful thing. And yes, we have to learn to find this balance, to simplify, but not oversimplify. So that's the difficulty, you know, from both sides. Yeah, the non-native side puts a lot of work and effort, and it takes years to study and learn a language to a decent level. It really, really does. I'm learning Portuguese at the moment and I'm sweating. 1 hour of lessons in Portuguese and I'm exhausted. I need to have a nap. And this is the third, fourth language I'm learning. So it really takes a toll on you. So yes, give them a little bit of credit for making an effort to learn this language. But also from the other side, don't oversimplify, if I could say simplify, but don't oversimplify, if that makes sense. It's the empathy. I will come back to empathy, is being aware, being able to put yourself in the other person's shoes a little bit. I think that's the key.
And just thinking to yourself, isn't it? What does this person need from me? Or successful communication to take place? Which words do I need to use? Should I change my rate of speech? Should I avoid certain phrases? And if you can put yourself in their shoes, as you say, then that way communication can be much more positive for both sides.
So yes, if I may, I do have a little question for you. Yeah, sure. I discovered 𝗀𝗄𝗏 just recently, and I think it's a really brilliant idea. It's a great principle. And my question is maybe a little bit controversial, but I would like to know if you came across any kind of resistance from native speakers. What kind of their first impressions of the project and the idea?
It's interesting you say that, and thank you for the compliment about 𝗀𝗏𝗏. I'm glad you like the idea. There seems to be a huge need for it and for this type of training, and there are other people in the field who are doing similar, really good work. In terms of native speakers' perceptions of it, it can fall into two categories, really, broadly. One is people just didn't realize that there was a problem in the first place. Because, as we were saying before, with English being a lingua franca, you tend to assume automatically that because you speak English as your first language, you're able to communicate. And actually, the biggest challenge we face is in raising awareness that actually, no, that's not always the case. And a lot of people are saying that the way that native English speak, I can't speak myself. A lot of people are saying that the way that native English speakers speak or write, as you mentioned with emails, can be problematic. So pointing that out can often be quite a revelation to people. The first impression or the first thought is, English is my first language, therefore I don't have a problem. In terms of there being resistance, yes, sometimes there is. Sometimes people do have what I would call an old-fashioned, arrogant attitude that the language belongs to me, I speak it perfectly, and if you don't understand me, go away and learn it better. I would say those people are really in the minority. There aren't very many of them. Our experience is that most people, A, want to communicate well, and B, also really want to help. So they get the idea that if they make some small changes to the way they communicate, going back to empathy, like you were saying, it can have such a positive effect. And of course, most people, particularly in business, we're communicating to get things done.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to say.
I'm not really going into a sales meeting to make friends or because I want you to like me. I'm going there because I've got sales targets I need to meet. I need to sell you this product. And if that means I change the way I communicate, fine. Or it might be you're recruiting people for a job and you need the best people for the job. And if that means you ask questions in a certain way or rephrase the questions on an application form to attract the best talent, you're going to do that because there is a transactional nature to a lot of the English being used. It's there for a function. And in some respects, I think English is quite unusual like that.
Yeah.
It is very much the language of business. It's not always the language of love. You know?
That's Italian.
That's Italian. So I think for that reason, because we have this desire to communicate and this need, and I think maybe I'm an optimist. I think very positively about human nature. Fundamentally, people want to help.
No, it's great to hear from you, and I'm really glad to hear that. You know, there is only this minority of people who are a little bit old-fashioned in the way they're thinking about language and communication. And what you said about, especially in business, it's a transactional way of communication. And sometimes the aim, well, in most cases, the aim is the key, you know, it's the most important thing. How you get there, it's another story. So if the target, the transactional target is the most important thing, if little errors happen on the way, but you still achieve your aim, job's done, you know, and focusing on this transactional thing. I don't know if we have time, but I do have one little parable that I could tell you.
Please.
I think it's a story that took place in Singapore. There was a British lady who needed medicine for her blood pressure. And she didn't have a prescription. It was not a prescription-based medicine. She just had to take something very quickly. So she went into the pharmacy, and there was a lady there that could speak pretty good English, but she was focusing on herself. She was focusing on giving her the full range and the detailed explanation of this medicine, that medicine, this is for that, and da. So she was kind of maybe showing off with her skills. And then the lady still didn't know which one she should take. And her assistant, who could barely speak English, she just came up to her, lady, this for your heart, this for something else. And she just said it in a very, very simple way and solved the problem.
That's great. So simplicity won.
And I think that's the key, you know. Sometimes we think about grammar and overthink about which tense we should use, like which one is the correct way, and we forget about the aim. And that's it. Business is a transactional type of communication. Get the job done.
And I see the same thing sometimes within academia as well, where there's almost a tradition really of rewarding people for flowery, complicated, so-called sophisticated language. And you can have a tendency to show off by using unnecessarily long words and very convoluted grammar. And actually, by doing that, you're not explaining anything. Very few people understand you. And unless you want to be part of some self-serving, self-defined elite, which some people do.
Or a literature club.
Say again?
Or a literature club, book club.
Yeah, exactly. But if you want to communicate more broadly and get your message across, simplification is key. Absolutely. Justina, it's been an absolute pleasure talking with you today. Thank you very much indeed.
Likewise. Thank you very
I really
much.
appreciate it. Thank you.